And hello, everybody. Welcome to a special edition of Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegspiel, or whatever we're calling it these days. I'm calling it How I Lost World War II for Japan in 1942. And I bet you are wondering, how can you do the same? Well, stay tuned because I'm going to tell you how you can lose World War II in 1942 for Japan in 3 easy steps. So here we are with Achilles, who ran the game. And hello, Achilles. Just say hi to the screen. You can't even see the screen.
Howdy, screen.
And my victorious opponent, Fidelis, who played as the United States player. And I just figured, hey, I have to go easy on this guy. I have to basically lose the game because that would be unpatriotic of me as an American to defeat this poor U.S. player. So how's it going, Fidelis?
It's going well. Thanks for going easy on me, I guess, then, right?
Oh, I assure you, I tried my hardest, and well, it just didn't measure up. So I found the game absolutely fantastic. It was a lot of fun. It was very engaging. It was very compelling and exciting. And I was even dictating orders to poor Achilles over the phone while driving. So
I didn't know that was an option, Achilles. We could do that.
Yeah, it was a special case. I was on my way to the GMT West convention in Hanford. So I'm telling him, this is what I want. This is my intention, And I guess he's diligently taking notes and just laughing, because he knows, he sees all. But let's start with you, Achilles. Let's have you talk about, set the stage for us.
Okay.
And tell us what was going on. And while you do that, I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. And what I am sharing is my tabletop that I created so that I could have a little more fun with this. I spent a whole evening creating this. I went and hunted down all the miniatures. And if you see these orange lines back and forth, you see that these are my operational plans for May of 1942. You may think I'm going the wrong direction, and you'd be absolutely right. But we'll talk about why and what was going on. So, Achilles, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Okay. Well, first of all, I labeled this the Barrier and the Javelin, which is a homage to an excellent book from a naval historian who talks about this very period. And this period particularly, this is one of those things that fascinates me because it is a critical strategic decision point that Japan faced in the early part of 1942. The overall situation is, of course, you have Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. From that point up until April of 1942, the Japanese have basically been successful everywhere. In fact, they've been far more successful than they actually expected to be. They've taken, they've run through Thailand, they've taken most of Burma, they've taken Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, much of the Solomon chain they took Rabaul and that area, Guam and Wake, of course, and the Philippines and Hong Kong. So they established the original concept that they had for their defensive perimeter in the Pacific. And they reached that stage, and in their pre-war planning and in their thinking, it was their belief that if they were able to accomplish this, that the Allies would negotiate, that the Allies would look at it and say, it's far too costly for us to retake all of that. Let's make a deal. That was their original thinking. Now, they reached that stage and very quickly understood that that wasn't happening. So they came to the realization that they needed to do something more, but they couldn't figure out what. They had no plan for after the first plan. They had no plan for how do we win? How do we win the war at this stage? Mm-hmm. And what they were presented with was, they came up with 3 possible operations. One was into the Indian Ocean, trying to support the army's efforts in Burma going into India. The idea being that they could, if they could get into India, they could destabilize the British there, because the people of India would rise up. They had Indian nationalists who had formed ground units for the Japanese at this point already, once Singapore had been taken. And the leader of that group was promising them, if you can get to India, the people of India will rise up against the British. That move would have probably knocked the British at least out of this theater.
Mm.
And that would have been a huge blow to the Allies going forward. But the Army was requesting that the Navy conduct a major operation into the Indian Ocean, take out the Royal Navy forces there, and support their operations against India, which, a landing at Ceylon or even on the east coast of India could have accomplished. Okay, so that was one possibility. A second possibility was down here in the South Pacific. If they could go down the Solomon's chain, take some of these islands, such as Guadalcanal, put airfields on them, take Gilly Gilly and Port Moresby over here, they can threaten the route of communication between the United States and Australia. Basically, the further south they can get, and eventually they would like to get all the way down to, say, Noumea. That would allow them, with airfields on each of these locations, to basically cut off communications from the U.S. to Australia, except for the extreme long route, which would make supplying any forces in Australia very difficult, nearly impossible. Which, Australia becomes a major base for the Allies in their counter offensives against the Japanese. Without that, the Allies would have a really tough time trying to break the Japanese perimeter. So that's another. The third operational concept was the one that Yamamoto had, which was the strike at Midway. And we all know what happened there. His thinking was that if he goes after Midway and the Aleutian Islands up here, he's going to draw the American carriers, what remains of the American carrier fleet, out to fight. And he hopes to ambush the American carriers with the entire Kido Butai, 6 carriers, and destroy them. And if he can accomplish that, basically it'll take, he calculates, it'll take several years for the U.S. to build up enough force to threaten the Japanese perimeter again. And they might be able to get the Americans to negotiate at that point. So those are the 3 operational plans. Now, in history, the Japanese couldn't decide between the 3, so they tried to do all 3 of them. They went into the Indian Ocean first. Then, after that operation, they tried to go down towards Guadalcanal and Port Moresby, which led to the Battle of Coral Sea, which happened in May of 1942. And then, as a result of that battle, 2 of their fleet carriers were essentially out of action. So when they went to Midway, they only had 4 fleet carriers instead of 6. And they, of course, everybody knows what happens at Midway. They lose all 4 of those carriers at Midway.
Yeah.
So it was like dominoes. The results of each of these actions impacted the next operation. The Kido Butai going into the Indian Ocean accomplished very little because they couldn't stay for very long, because they needed to be back in time to get ready for the next operations. And so as a result, they accomplished very little there. They expended pilots and wear and tear on the ships and the planes and everything else in the process. Then they had to sail all the way back to the home islands to get those ships ready for the next operation. They split off 2 of their fleet carriers to go down here to do the Solomon Islands, and they end up in the Battle of Coral Sea. One of them gets badly damaged. The other one loses most of its air group. And so they're both out of action for what happens at Midway. So you can see how each one impacted the other one. So what I presented to the to our two protagonists here was that situation slightly altered, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But slightly altered, and asked the Japanese player, who's Marshall, to determine his own objectives. What operation or operations did he want to try to pursue? What did he want to do? And he could have picked anything. If he'd want to, he could have gone completely off script and sent everybody down here and tried to take Darwin or something, you know. But he could make the choice.
Yeah, I decided not to attack Australia there. That was punishment enough for them to be down there.
Yeah. Now, so that was his conditions, and he had all of the Japanese forces that were available for prior to Coral Sea, without the Indian Ocean operation. So that meant that everything was intact going in, and he could pick which of these he wanted to do, or which combination he wanted to do. He could have gone for two of them, or all three, or just one. For the Allies, for our friend Fidelis here, they were given the task of trying to determine what the main Japanese thrust was going to be and trying to prevent it from accomplishing all of its goals. They needed to blunt it, and at the same time, try to do at least equal damage to the Japanese carrier forces, if possible, and any other little operations that they might want to attempt, given their resources, they could do to try to throw the Japanese off, or to achieve some objective that the Japanese weren't prepared for. So he was given those tasks, basically. He didn't know where the blows were going to land. He didn't know what the full Japanese force would be or where it was going to go. Now, the next part of the setup was some of the alternate things, which is it primarily was in the OOB. The Japanese start out with all of the forces that they had May 1st, 1942, prior to Coral Sea. The Allies, in this particular case, in this little bit of alternate history, the Allies were given, in this case, the British and the Americans, because of the run that the Japanese had been on, and because the British felt threatened in India, and the Americans realized that Australia was in the balance, that the Allies decided to do a little bit higher commitment to the Pacific than they actually did historically. So as a result, they had transferred the carriers from the Atlantic to the Pacific. They had boosted the amount of aircraft that was going to the Pacific, aircraft and pilots going to the Pacific, and they detached a few more ground forces. Now, it wasn't a huge bump from what they had historically, but it was a bump. It meant that they had a little more to operate with than they actually had in May of 1942. So that's how I alternated that. Now, as things played out, you can see the lines that Marshall's drawn here. This was his planning. He had forces. He had a task force in Saigon, I believe that is. Yes. Singapore. He had his most of his main forces were in the Japanese home islands. To start the game, he got a pre-May move, which was he could send any forces he wanted to send from that were in base on the home islands. and he could send them out, pre-deploy them to where he wanted to go within a certain distance. Do you remember what the distance was, Marshall?
It was what,
15 hexes, I believe.
Hexes, yeah.
Yeah, it was 15 hexes from whatever base they were in on the home islands. They had to go to a port that was within that range. Okay, so at that point, he could send his forces out to pre-position them for whatever operations he wanted to do. Now, if you can see all of his little flags on the board. Those are all bases. Okay.
I love the miniatures, Marshall.
You may notice that Marshall did not bother to put the Allied bases on the board.
No, it was completely unnecessary.
But he did put his own. Now, for this operation, only a certain number of the bases that you see were active. The others were considered to be involved in other operations. So there were only certain bases which he had that he could actively use. His opponent doesn't know which ones they are. He knows all those flags out there are Japanese bases, but he doesn't know which ones are active for this operation. Mm-hmm. Each base will have some amount of aircraft on it and will defend itself. It'll defend its own hex if attacked, but it can't be used for offensive operations or for interceptions unless it's an active base. Okay. And the same was true for the Allies. The Allies had all their bases out here all across the Pacific, but only a certain number of them were actually active for his use. Okay. So you can see the Japanese planning here. You can see what Marshall intended. And he pre-positioned almost the entirety of his naval forces into this region here, basically, with the intent, as you can see from his lines, he was going to go towards the Solomons and the Coral Sea, and Port Moresby. That was his primary thrust. He completely ignored Midway, wasn't going to bother with that, and he sent the task forces that were actually over here in the Western Pacific area in the South China Sea. He was sending them to go reinforce his forces in the Solomons. So he was basically abandoning this area as far as the naval surface forces were concerned. Now, that was safe enough because any British attempt to come out of the Indian Ocean and hit him over in this region would have been met with multiple airfields, which could hit him. So it was relatively safe. The British had been reinforced. They actually had a couple more carriers than the British actually had at the time in the Indian Ocean. But the British carriers tend to be smaller. They carry smaller air groups, and they're not as effective as the American fleet carriers. The Americans, on the other hand, I should say, they had 6 fleet carriers, but they were spread out. If I remember correctly, there were 2 that started in Fiji.
Yep.
2 that started in Samoa, and 2 that started at Pearl Harbor. So Fidelis had to try to figure out where are the Japanese going, and then try to interrupt it. Now, as part of the mechanics of this game, I had signals and signal interception. Now, there was no reading of messages because the Japanese changed their code just prior to this event. And as a result, the U.S. couldn't read the codes. But they were still intercepting radio signals from task forces and from bases, which meant that if once a fleet was at sea, if Marshall, for example, wanted to order one of his task forces to go to whatever position, whatever place, or he wanted to send an order to them of any kind, he'd have to send a signal to them. And that signal would be, or could be, intercepted. There was about a 80% chance that it would be intercepted. So sometimes they weren't. But that provides a kind of intel for your opponent, because if you see a significant number of messages, and it's going to be from whatever the nearest receiving station is. So if you see a number of sudden signals being sent in, let's say, down here around, to Rabaul, then there's considerable enemy activity in this area and multiple task forces. Okay. So if he wanted to order 4 of his task forces to change their orders or something like that, there would be 4 potential intercepts there. That would tell the Allies that there were 4 task forces in this area. He wouldn't know what they were consisting of, but he'd know that's a lot of activity in this region. And it could give him some kind of indication as to what was happening. Now, things that I'm going to start with Marshall. Things that Marshall did well. Short list.
I spelled
teasing.
my name correctly.
He did.
I colored inside the lines.
Achilles,
before we go on that list, should we talk about our operational plans, both sides, maybe?
Okay, if you would choose to do so, you may do so.
Yeah, maybe we do that, because it's like we're at the top. We've got the 30,000 foot view. Now let's drop down to 20,000 and try it that way. I'm excited to hear the list, though.
I'm excited to read the list. I am.
Yeah.
Very excited. As you can tell, I'm jumping at the chance. Okay, go ahead.
He wrote it on a strip of fortune cookie on the back of a fortune cookie. Fortune is such a long list,
Marshall, I'm excited to hear about your operational perspective, because this is the first I'm seeing of your map. And so I spent all of the 7-8 days we played this to try to figure out where the heck are you and what are you trying to do.
Did you create a module for yourself? Or?
I do. I have my own. I did not make it look as pretty as yours. I used some D10s and then set them all to be the task force numbers, and then used some Axis and Allies models to represent a few of the fighters.
Do you want to share it?
I don't know if I'm able. How am I able to through the TTS?
I think what we could do is, you're right. I think that's kind of hard. You could exit here and present on your screen and then rejoin this in a minute. But I think that's how we would do it. So if you pull it up,
it might be easier if I just draw on the one that you have.
That works too. I just wanted to show everybody how my map is superior to yours.
Oh,
that's
well,
all.
That's
clear.
Okay. That's not in question, so we don't have.
All right, so that's basically a surrender right there.
That's on the list that Achilles has.
So we're tied
Marshall's
down,
one
Achilles.
victory.
Although I did have a stunning 3-dimensional Commodore standing on Ragoon at one point, which we can talk about when we get to that phase. But.
All right, go ahead, take it away. You know how to use the drawing tools and all that. Go ahead and show us. What was your plan?
So as I was looking, I spent a lot of time staring at this map, and I read through the mission briefing, and I understood at this phase of the war, you're going to have better pilots, and you're going to have a larger concentration of a fleet than I am. You're going to have more carriers, and they're probably going to be all together, and mine are going to be spread out. Some background to me, I am more of a tactical wargamer. I come from the Commands and Colors crowd on the board game side, and have started dabbling more on the miniature side of things. So
it's a gateway, huh?
It's a gateway, yes. Strategic level.
The dangers of miniatures.
Yes, exactly. And so
miniatures and heroin.
Exactly. Except they cost the same amount, probably. No, so basically, as I read through the briefing, there was those 3 potential moves you could make. You could either strike through the Solomons, you could strike out to India, or you can make a strike on Midway. And so I tried to place myself in your shoes of what would I do if I was Japan. I'm going to have at a single point probably a greater concentration of force than I am on the reactive side. So looking at the map, I think in a meta sense, I predicted that you would rule out a move on Midway. That didn't work out historically. I probably wouldn't just try that a second time, kind of thing. So I assumed you probably wouldn't make a move on Midway. So that left me with India and the Solomons. I felt that India was a potential, and so you'll see that I did some things there. So I had, I'm using my desktop here. So I had some fleet presence here on what's this island? I need to zoom in more on my side and Ceylon, and then I had my fleet up in Calcutta and Dhaka, up here in the north. And so I had no idea where you are. My briefing basically said the Japanese fleet was spotted in home waters 2 weeks ago. And that's the last we know of where they are, which is you could be anywhere on the map at that point, and from my perspective. So I didn't know if you had a large fleet just hanging out, waiting to come up into Rangoon in Burma and just start landing troops there. And so my thought was if I was you, that would be a good play, was to make a move on India, but the stronger play would have been the Solomons, which you cleverly did. You concentrated your force and made a move towards the Solomons. Because I felt like the biggest win you could have would be separating Australia from the United States in their communication. So I thought the biggest threat was the Hebrides, the New Hebrides Islands down here. I thought that if you struck there and separated the United States line of communication between Australia, that's going to be a big loss for me. So I figured you might make a play, a Coral Sea type play, to come down through the slot or over the top, kind of as you did, either come down from the Marshalls, come down from the top in here. So I started with a fleet present along the east coast of Australia here, and then my carriers were stretched out in this ring out to the east, like that. That's I started in those ports, kind of set back. And so as the reactionary player, I didn't know where you were going to make a move to initially. I sort of in my head ruled out Midway, and I had a small task force up in the gosh, what is that?
Aleutians.
The Aleutians, yes, and Dutch Harbor. That's what I was looking for, Dutch Harbor. And then I had a carrier fleet out of Pearl. And so my initial move was to basically move out of Midway and Pearl and come out west of Midway to see if you make a move there, to try to start reconning that big open blank space in the top middle of the map to see it. Am I going to sense any movement? Am I going to get any intercepts from signals telling me that you're moving towards Midway? I was pretty sure you weren't going to do it, but I didn't feel like I had the luxury to just say, okay, he's not going to do it. Send everybody from Pearl south, send all my ships from Pearl south and leave the north and leave, what is actually part of the United States, the Aleutians, completely undefended. Because that could have been a geographic objective that you might have, right? You might try to go grab an Aleutian island from me, kind of in that process to distract me. So I had this ring, and I'm mainly watching the Solomons to see, is he going to poke his head through there to kind of tip your cards that you're coming my direction. I didn't get any initial evidence that you were doing so. I only saw movement through intercepts along the Philippines area. I think I picked
There was
up
a submarine detection.
Yes, I had a submarine that detected some fleet movement, but they were moving east when they spotted them and not moving towards India. And so I had a feeling, okay, if they're moving east, they're probably going towards the Solomons. I doubt they're going to go northeast and towards Japan and then out towards Midway. And so as the defensive player, I didn't want to tip where is my strength located. I didn't want to reveal it to you. So basically my United States fleets and my Australian fleets in the bottom, they sat stationary for a good several days, kind of waiting for me to understand more. And I knew that you couldn't intercept anything from them once I gave their first orders. They just get handed an envelope, say, hey, move to these coordinates, and there's no way you can intercept that. So I had to try to figure out what you were doing. So my clever plan was, I'm going to start causing a ruckus somewhere to see if you respond to it, and maybe I would get some indication of where you have some force. So I had a lot of long range bomber bases across northern Australia, and then a few Port Moresby. And so I started, I think Achilles got tired of reading my orders of these little air bases. This one, go bomb here, concentrate on the air facility. This one, go bomb here, concentrate on the port facility. And every day I would rotate some different bombing sections to poke you at different bases to see if you would respond and maybe send something that direction. And then in the Indian Ocean, I sent the British fleet to go land at Rangoon. Achilles and I had some great conversations after playing a different game about what would be the long-term ramifications of the British landing in Rangoon. Probably a hopeless proposition at that phase of the war, but I wanted to create some kind of noise. I was debating between that and grabbing Wake Island, of just blitzing out and trying to steal Wake Island from you to make some kind of attention grabbing item to make you maybe move some force that direction, which would then tell me where your force is. But other than that, I basically sat stationary at this along the New Hebrides there, waiting for you to move. And as I kept hearing silence and then started getting little glimmers of, signals intercepted of stuff closer to the Solomons, I started getting the sense that you were coming that direction. So Achilles noticed a few days before you started to get there, I cheated up my defenses. I was sitting farther back along the edge of the board, and I came up to more where I have the blue line. Now I moved up to that frontal line, saying, okay, if he's coming, I want to be able to respond. So my fleets came out of I started moving out of Australia, and I started coming up to the top of New Hebrides and placed one task force on Espiritu Santo to hopefully wait there. They were actually carrying I think it was a battalion of Marines.
A brigade of Marines.
A brigade of Marines.
Yeah.
So they had a whole bunch of transport ships, and my plan was, if you start to reveal yourself, swinging around to Port Moresby, I would come over the top and grab Guadalcanal. Or if you coming across Guadalcanal, they might go underneath and try to grab, move towards one of the rest of New Guinea and support there. Try to grab an island, as I knew as a part of the mechanics, if I hold an island in there, I've got an unsinkable aircraft carrier that I'll start populating air crew on there that could then start reconning the area and give me an idea of where you were. But our timing ended up being, I think, just perfect, Marshall, because I had cheated up my ships to Espiritu Santo right as your landing task force was approaching it. And so that's where we kind of had our first big conflict, was right on that line.
Unbelievable. I tell you, I knew you had cheated.
I read you like a book, Marshall.
You did. You did.
Damn you, Marshall! I read your book.
Yeah.
Well, as part of my defense too, I didn't want you to know, because I had my best air crew was the Enterprise and the Yorktown, and they were farther to the east, and so I had set them in their positions so that if you do make that move, the Enterprise and the Yorktown would actually arrive last. They would be basically in the rear. So that you'd be engaging my first task force, and I would then have a sense of where is your stuff, and then I could position my most experienced air crew to then hit you wherever you have a concentration of carriers.
Yeah. My plan was, I knew that we only had a month, so I knew that I could really only probably do one thing well. As it turns out, I couldn't even do that. Surprise, surprise. But I wanted to put all my eggs in one basket, and I knew that all of this other stuff that was going on were distractions. I just figured these are distractions. That's not the main objective. And I figured that if I take Port Moresby in particular, Gilly Gilly, Guadalcanal, and Espiritu Santo, I would cut you off from Australia, or at least be so far along the way of doing it that it would count as a victory. And while doing that, I had hopes that you would reveal your fleet, which I expected to come out of the north. I figured, hey, he's at Pearl Harbor or something, and he's going to come down this way. And as he does, you'll see that I have my task forces here. I have task force 1 and 2. And I am just ready to pounce. And I put Task Force 3 all the way down to Espiritu Santo. So that was really the bait to draw you out. And then as you perhaps went after Task Force 3, you'd be detected. And then the WWII, which is Task Force 1 and 2 here, would just slam into you. And that would be the end of your fleet. And then I would win the war in essentially one day.
Mm-hmm. So you basically transported Midway to Espiritu Santo and tried to do the same play, but
Precisely. That is precisely it. I had these smaller task forces, and many of them had landing elements, so SNLFs. So, you had naval landing forces. And so I wanted to use those and drop those guys off in places like Guadalcanal, Gilly Gilly, Port Moresby, and of course, Espiritu Santo. And the hope was I could drop all these guys off to take these islands and then turn north and meet you as you're coming south. And of course, not even close. I had no idea that your carriers were already kind of pre-positioned at Fiji and Samoa, in which case I was in a lot of hot water, but I didn't recognize it. Now, had I known that your carrier fleet was in Fiji and Samoa, I could have tried to do a defeat in detail. Or I could have tried to cut off the fleet coming from the north, which probably would have been the easiest thing to do. But no, I had no idea. I imagined that your fleet was going to be concentrated from the start. And I knew that I had a limited amount of time to drop my units off and take these islands, these strategic locations. And then I was going to concentrate my fleet. And if I didn't know where you were by then, I was going to put a lot of effort into finding you and destroying you. Mm-hmm. So I was looking for the decisive battle. And well, I think the decisive battle found me before I was ready for it. I think it's interesting that we both identified Espiritu Santo as the key objective of the entire campaign. Like both of us zeroed in on that and said, hey, right here, this is where it's going to go down. I chose that and I thought, it's kind of out of the way. It's down there. You probably are going to be trying to guard multiple locations, I figured. So I figured that you would be looking out up here and not quite sure what to do with yourself, and that you weren't going to concentrate effectively until you had detected my main force. And of course, I had given strict orders to my main force that they were not really to communicate radio silence. I think I had task forces combined, and wherever I had a combined task force, one was allowed to communicate, the other was ordered to travel in silence, but in close proximity, so they could theoretically communicate with signals, light signals or whatever. But that way, I would have a larger force, and you would think, well, it's a task force, but it might not be a large one. And then if you did try to attack it, you'd run into a much larger force. So that was my logic. And I ignored all the other stuff, but I was really disappointed that Rangoon fell. I was very upset with the army on that. I was hoping to get some crab Rangoons, and well, I guess not anymore. But there we have it.
So my biggest fears about your play would have been, because as it spread so thin, I was afraid you would make a strike due east towards this area. I had to leave this basically open. Yeah. And I was also afraid of this area here because I had no fleet presence over there. And if you just came down and started launching carrier-based bombers on the mainland of Australia, I wouldn't have a net response to it.
Yeah, but while I could do that and get away with it, what's the payoff?
Right.
I might score a propaganda victory like the Japanese did when they bombed Darwin or something. But I'm not advancing the strategic cause of the Japanese. I'm simply taking easy wins. I'm stealing the blinds, if you will, in a game of poker, when what I have to do is get you to commit and go all in and beat you with a full house or something.
Well, the reason why it was my fear too is we were playing a month-long game of 28 turns, right?
Yeah.
And so if you start bombing me there, I'm gonna have to send something over to respond to it, and then I'm stretching myself even thinner across that frontage. Before that, I knew you're gonna come at me with a big fist of a whole handful of carriers, right?
Mhm.
I was thinking that you wouldn't want to split up your strength, as is what befell the Japanese at Midway. Of after committing to all three operations at the same time, they didn't have a concentration, and you wouldn't want to make the same mistake. So I figured you would have a single thrust somewhere.
Well, that's where you're wrong. See, you're assuming that if I bomb Australia, you have to respond, and absolutely you don't. Just look at the example I set in Rangoon. You attacked there, and I didn't have to respond, not at all. All they did was send me an angry letter. So
Yeah, well, we could talk about what that cost you.
yeah, I can't even read Japanese, so jokes on them.
There was a mechanic that I put into the game, not expecting that it would actually get triggered, but it did. And that was if the Allies did something like that, if they were to take Rangoon, some kind of major thing in the Indian Ocean, that the Japanese army, because the Japanese army and the Japanese Navy had this massive inter-service rivalry, the Japanese army would be infuriated with the Navy for not having done the operation they wanted them to do in the Indian Ocean and not having assisted them. And as a result, they withdrew all of their air support in the Indian Ocean area. So all the Japanese army air bases in that region stopped being active bases. And that left him only with the naval base over here.
Well, again, the joke is on the army again, because I didn't have any ships out there.
That's right. And in the end, it didn't change any. It wasn't materially impactful.
Right.
But it was just an interesting thing, and I had stuck it in there as a mechanic. And because it happened, I rolled to see if it was triggered, and it was. And so, I
never knew that.
I sent this army officer and a couple of his privates with rifles to Marshall's office, where he handed him an angry letter and refused to bow to him, and then walked out of the office, telling him that the army was no longer going to participate in the operations in the Indian Ocean with the Navy.
See, that's interesting. I never knew that, because on my map, I had set up the Royal Navy had basically a defensive line just out of recon range of those bases, waiting for you to respond. Like send a destroyer or something up this way to go poke
there
around.
Was nothing coming.
I was waiting, because I was debating, do I try to swing them around Sumatra and bring them down to that northern coast of Australia to help defend where it's open? But I also saw how many air bases you have all the way along there, Borneo and everything, that I would just get pulverized all the way to Australia. So I didn't want to make that move. But I was waiting for you're going to send a light fleet carrier and some, like a destroyer task force up there to go poke around at Ceylon or something like that. But you never came. So I had the Royal Navy on general quarters for the whole game with nothing to do.
Well, so it goes. The Royal Navy runs sodomy and the lash. All right. Well, so let's quit stalling here now, and let's talk about all the things I did well.
Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. There were some. Well, first of all, we'll start with the overall plan. The overall plan was actually a good one. He picked a vitally important strategic location. As he said, he did not allow himself to get distracted by what would have been basically a show, trying to bomb Darwin or something like that, which really wouldn't have achieved anything strategic for the Japanese. He went after a major strategic objective. Now, in this case, if he had gone after any of the those three main operations, the Midway one, landing and taking Midway would have meant nothing strategically. Right. But if he had been able to destroy the carriers out there without taking equal loss, that would have been a major Japanese victory. Certainly, that's the only way he could have achieved one up here. Down here, he could achieve his objective both by destroying the American carriers, doing damage to the American fleet, but also by these geographic locations. If he takes Guadalcanal, Gilly Gilly, Port Moresby, those three together probably give him a marginal victory if he doesn't lose more carriers than you do. Taking Espiritu Santo, that in conjunction with those things, that makes it a decisive victory, because that would have been strategically far more than the Japanese were able to do, and certainly more than they could have really hoped for in their best dreams. The other possibility was if he goes to the Indian Ocean. If he goes to the Indian Ocean, he could have won a decisive victory here as well, and this would have been the easiest one, because the only thing he would have faced was the British air groups here and the British fleet, and he was vastly superior to them, and that could have made the difference if he had done that operation and been successful. Say, taken Ceylon, landed troops there. Again, that's well beyond what the Japanese were able to achieve, and probably, I mean, yeah, that would have been a major victory for the Allies. As he did, his planning wasn't wrong. That's for sure. He made an excellent plan. He concentrated his force, and it was that concentration of force which gave him his advantage. So he concentrated his force. He went after a major strategic objective. So he did everything right in that regard. Another thing that was very cleverly done was sending the Kido Butai down here to sit in ambush on total radio silence. Their orders were that they weren't to break radio silence until the 7th. Okay. So 7 days into the operation. So basically, they arrived there and they were sitting there for like 3 days without sending any signal. So in a way, he was blind because he didn't know where the Kido Butai actually was, because there wasn't a standard movement as a mechanic in this game. Movement had some randomness to it. And as a result, he didn't know how long it would actually take them to get to their destination. And he would not know that they arrived at their destination from what their orders were, unless they sent a signal saying we've arrived. And he ordered them to be radio silent until the 7th. So basically, he didn't even know where his primary carrier fleet was. He knew where it was going, but he didn't know if it was there yet. And so it was kind of sitting out here, and it was obviously in a great ambush position. And it would have been, had the American carriers presented themselves to them in a timely manner, but that didn't happen. Where mistakes were made.
So that's all the time we have for tonight, folks. I want to thank you all for tuning in.
Where
I feel like, to me,
I want to add real quick, Achilles, Marshall, that move with the Kido Butai was really brilliant. I had no idea where they were for a good majority of the game. I made assumptions based on where large concentrations of battleships were, that they probably weren't too far away. But Achilles could go into the details of all of that, but I could not recon a carrier to save my life, I think, in this game.
Yeah.
Nice.
He was getting contact reports from the task forces coming down this way.
Yeah.
And over here. And as a result, I mean, those were the only contact reports he was getting. And since the Kido Butai is like over here, he doesn't know where they are. They were a black hole in the ocean, basically. But he's getting reports of task forces over here. And that could easily have led him to think, okay, that's where they are. And then, if he comes up this way to try to get to them, he's crossing right into the Kido Butai.
That was exactly my plan.
Yeah. And that could have been certainly devastating.
And we would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids.
One thing that Fidelis did that I want to say was well thought or well thought. It was a good move. First of all, I'm going to congratulate him on going after Rangoon because it was kind of an unexpected thing, and even though it didn't fulfill the function of distracting the Japanese, it was not a bad idea at all. It might have worked, it didn't, but it still was impactful.
It's still a win.
Yeah, it's still a win. Yeah. Another thing that he did, and this, on both sides here, because it was something that Fidelis did that Marshall did not do, and that was the striking of the air bases. And I think for me, this is the one I circled the big time. Fidelis was attacking Japanese air bases with his land bases, land air bases, and that was suppressing these Japanese air bases. The Japanese air units in those regions were taking losses, and where they came really important were here and along here in New Guinea, because these were the most forward ones for the Japanese. These were the ones that could cover this region. And because they were getting hit and taking losses, their effectiveness was being drastically reduced. Now, I think, and again, it's my opinion, it's all debatable, but I think that this is something that the Japanese missed out on. They needed to suppress the Allied air bases because Port Moresby, York, these regions right here were able to hit anything coming down this slot. And more importantly, Espiritu Santo. Espiritu Santo was a major base, and this played into what happened really significantly. Because unlike these bases, which were Australian and Army Air Corps, this was Navy. And as a result, when his forces did come down here, they got detected, and then they started getting hit by the air base at Espiritu Santo. And they were getting hit by U.S. Navy aircraft, which were much more effective at attacking surface ships than the Army or Australians were. And also, his reports were saying U.S. naval aircraft are attacking our task force. So that would lead one to think they're coming off of carriers. And it would give him the indication that the American carriers were already in this area, which they were not. In fact, because they started so far away off to the east, it took them longer to get over here. The WWII was already moving into this area. There was already Japanese task forces piling up over here just off of Espiritu Santo. And the WWII was actually on its way to them. The American carriers were starting to arrive, but these guys were already getting hit, and they were getting hit by these naval aircraft coming off of Espiritu Santo, and that island's air bases were not suppressed. They were never bombed. And as a result, they were able to get those aircraft back up in the air. This played, I think, a really significant role because it was a very strong air base. It was like having 3 carriers there.
And it was one of my active ones, too, so
Yes.
I could decide what they do. They weren't just defensive.
And even though their quality wasn't as good as the Japanese carrier aircraft, they were whittling down those units, those air groups, and they were hitting targets. Specifically, Task Force 2 of WWII, because for whatever reason, and this was really crazy, but the American Task Force 2, which had Saratoga and Wasp, seemed to be the only American carrier task force that the Japanese could ever detect.
That's actually my Task Force 1, Achilles.
I'm sorry, Task Force 1. Yeah, Task Force 2 was the Enterprise in Yorktown. Task Force 2 never seemed to be found. I mean, they kept missing them over and over again on any attempt to detect. And part of that is because you have limited search assets. And as a result, if you're searching for targets down here, you don't have much to search for anything up here. And as a result, the Task Force 2, as you say, with the Enterprise in Yorktown, which had come in separately from over in this area, was not getting seen. But the same was true for the Japanese. Task Force 2 for the Japanese kept getting detected over and over again. But Task Force 1, which was in the same hex with Task Force 2, never could get detected. It was like, for whatever reason, they could find Task Force 2, but they couldn't find Task Force 1. It was like Task Force 1 was managing to stay in a rain squall the entire time. And it wasn't until, basically the last day when they actually found Task Force 1. By then, Task Force 2 had lost it lost 2 carriers, and the third one was basically without an air group. Their air groups were completely gone. Task Force 1, which was now the main striking power that he had left, then got hit by aircraft from Espiritu Santo, aircraft from the Yorktown and the Enterprise. The Japanese did manage to find the Yorktown and Enterprise on that last day, and they sent out a strike with what they had left, and they put 1 bomb hit on the Yorktown. But that was the best they could do. In the end, the Japanese they lost a light carrier, they lost 3 fleet carriers. The last one, which one was it? I believe I want to say it was Shokaku. She'd been hit 5 times. She was still afloat, but when the main Japanese force began to withdraw, she couldn't keep up. There was no way she was going to be able to stay with them. So essentially, the Japanese torpedoed it with their own destroyers and put it away because it was no longer able to keep up with the fleet. And other than that, the Saratoga was hit 5 times as well, but she was able to limp to, I believe, Funafuti.
I think it was Viti, or yeah.
Or was it Viti? Right. Oh yeah, you're right.
I sent her away.
It was Viti. Yeah, she was able to limp away to Viti without getting detected. There was another interesting order, and it was one of those Marshall doing Marshall things, which I was like, what on earth are you thinking? At the point where Wasp is sunk, Saratoga no longer has an operating air group, and she's just basically trying to limp home to Viti. He launches all of his fighters, and this was a specific order. Okay, this was a very specific order. I asked him, do you want to launch a strike? He says, no, I just want my fighters. The fighters are going to go there and destroy his fighters. Okay, so he's going to try to wipe out all of your cap so that they have nothing left to cover them, right? So he launches nothing but fighters and leaves his strike aircraft on board. If the strike aircraft had gone, they would have killed the Saratoga, but because they didn't, the Saratoga limps away. Those fighters get there, and there's nobody for them to fight because there's no carrier, there's no air group there. There's nothing left.
Only AA from destroyers and cruisers.
Yep. And instead,
North Carolina.
Instead, with all of his fighters now going over here to engage a non-existent cap, that's when Espiritu Santo's fighter strike arrives, and Enterprise and Yorktown's groups arrive, and there's no cap because all of his fighters are out here.
Yeah, I was going to finish you off once and for all. I thought you had lost 2 carriers. I was wrong. I had made an assumption, and then I figured, we're just going to finish this once and for all. We're going to take out all your fighters, and now your carriers are defenseless. And at a minimum, you immediately have to withdraw, or worse, if you don't, I can go and finish you off later in the day. And and so
I was thinking about it. I'm not gonna. I mean, I knew I was in a good position, but I'm playing a 28 turn game and I'm even thinking about 1943 as I need to preserve these carriers as best as possible and just try to damage you. Like I got 2 carriers here. I'm gonna try to hit you 1 or 2 more times, and then I'm gonna back off towards Fiji, and try to get behind my air screen again. But I never saw where your whole carrier concentration was. I only got signals telling me there's a lot of task force there, and I'm getting carrier aircraft hitting me on the island. So you're clearly within range. And so I didn't have my screen up, as you can see, I have like X's of where your air screen is and where like this is a potential area where you could be. And I'm trying to tighten the noose on that area from a couple different sides.
Yeah, I just figured that if I could put enough hurt on you, I didn't have to sink you. If I get you to turn away and I could take Espiritu Santo, that would be a win for the campaign, even if not the war. It would at least be a marginal victory for me, and didn't happen. So there you have it.
We had that mechanic, Achilles, for contesting a place if we both land forces at the same place over the course of the month.
And that happens that happened at Guadalcanal. The Japanese landed at Guadalcanal, and they were on the 3rd day where they would have gotten an operational airfield when your task force arrives and lands Marines. And now it's a contested island, so they're fighting over Henderson Field. So it was beautiful. it was beautifully historical, because the Japanese land there first, and just as they're like getting an airfield ready and all that, suddenly the Americans land with Marines, and now it's a contested island.
Yep. No, I as I was playing this, I'm staring at the map, and I think I understood in a new way why did we land at Guadalcanal? Oh, that's why. It'd be really nice to have that, to be able to do some recon and up the slot and to know what's coming from the marshals. And I had positioned Task Force 4, which had the Brigade of Marines at Espiritu Santo as a reserve, that if you do have Guadalcanal, or maybe you do grab Gili, that they were going to come in behind something and try to contest and take it back. Or if I saw the big pressure coming at Espiritu, I would back them off and maybe come back and try to grab it if things went bad. But they turned into be they were the anvil, the little landing force ended to be the anvil against all of your task force stacked up in the hex right next to this little landing force. What do they have? They had 3 carriers and 2 destroyers, and they're literally in the hex, so you can't come land on it. So I got lucky there, but that could have gone really sour. I think we caught that you were trying to land on it, and we caught you in the ocean, I think.
As a matter of fact, that the task force that had his landing troops got caught as they were coming in, and they got hit by aircraft from here, and then they were unable to land troops here because your task force 4 was also sitting in this hex. And until they cleared the hex of naval forces, they couldn't conduct landing operations. So they were sitting right here. And eventually, the entire Japanese fleet was here. And they were all in this one hex, basically, concentrated right there. So it was interesting. If he had sent like a surface force, one of the surface forces in here to engage them, I don't know what would have happened, because it would have depended on whether it came up as a night engagement or not. If it doesn't, that surface force would have got decimated by the air groups. But if it came up as a night fight, the Japanese have an advantage in the night fight, especially with their long range torpedoes. So it would have been an ugly fight, off of the Espiritu Santo, which would have been quite interesting.
And my force composition really didn't. Everything either had a carrier and battleships with it, or they were. I mean, my Australian task force, one of them was like it's two cruisers and a can
heavy
of Vegemite.
Cruiser. Yeah, you had a heavy cruiser, a light cruiser, and a destroyer or something like that.
It's literally like 3 ships. I'm like, I don't know what like the Yamatos might be floating out there and Nagato's out there. Right? Like, what are they going to do against? Because he's going to have these big concentrations of big gun, big ships. And I've got the 3 ship task force that all I can do is either harass or maybe park them on places you might try to land to hopefully foil an attempt. But I figured that wouldn't last. I figured Task Force 4 was about to be screwed, because they're going to we're going to pull up a battleship and deal with those cruisers and destroyers pretty easily, but that never came.
Yeah. Well, there we go. Well, I suppose it is time for us to shake hands, and I'll go ahead and accept your defeat. And I'm gracious, of course.
You're so magnanimous.
So magnanimous.
Yeah. And this was a fantastic game. I really enjoyed it. I want to thank you, Achilles, for playing. And I definitely thank you, Fidelis, for playing with me. It was really cool not knowing who my opponent was, because I couldn't metagame. I couldn't say, well, this is somebody I know. And typically they tend to play very aggressive or very conservative, or they try to just do something wacky. I had no idea, and that really enhanced the experience, made it a lot more thought-provoking and compelling. So I appreciate that. So
yeah, it turned out not to be Jan.
Yeah.
And likewise, I had never played you before, so I had no idea what you would do, or if you were going to try clever tricks, or am I thinking too much about it and maybe you won't do the concentrated force. And like, I was constantly second guessing myself. This is my first Kriegspiel experience. So this is very fun, Achilles. Thank you for inviting me to it and letting me play.
You're more than welcome. And I think you turned out to be an inspired choice. I wanted to pick somebody that Marshall didn't know, but you were perfect, because he didn't know you, but at the same time you have experience with wargaming, but you don't have experience in IKS or with Kriegspiel, and yet you're familiar with IKS, and so you have familiarity with the ideas, but you hadn't played it, and so that was perfect. And I think I said this to Marshall, I think last night when we were talking. What I found, what was fascinating to me, was you didn't make any big mistakes. You didn't do anything. This is what I said to Marshall. You didn't do anything like over the top brilliant, but you didn't do anything over the top stupid either. You didn't make any critical errors, and that was the key. It's the winner is usually the guy who makes the least mistakes, and you didn't make anything that stands out as like, oh, this was a really bad idea. So and that was perfect. You played it beautifully. You played it perfectly, and I couldn't have asked for a better opponent in that regard for this. So it really worked out, and I learned a great deal about the mechanics of the system that I'm trying to create from running this, and it was so for me it was big win-win in that regard. So I was very happy to have you, and you did a great job. I was very, very pleased.
Thank you. No, it was my pleasure to play, and I think if you look back at the orders I sent, you can tell when I was really getting into it by how long and detailed my orders start to become. And
unlike Marshall's, which were shouting at me on the phone, or send everything, attack. It's like, okay, how am I supposed to interpret that? It's like, yes, Fidelis, I should send you his orders, Marshall, so that you know how to write them in the future.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Also, you should read the briefings more carefully, buddy, because the task force you sent to Port Moresby in the OOB very clearly does not have any amphibious assault ships. There were no landing troops with that group. So I'm not sure what they were supposed to do when they got there.
Neither was I. I was a little alarmed by parking a battleship off of the coast of Port Moresby, but there's no landing ship spotted. Like, do I not see another task force coming? Or,
that was just misdirection. See, it worked.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was fooled everyone.
It was interesting for me because I think Achilles, you and I were chatting about this as I was doing my last orders. Like, there's the temptation of there's the wargaming temptation of I'm going to send every boat I have on the map to the Solomons now to go fight you, when realistically, Washington probably would not let me send the Pearl carriers down to leave all of Pearl Harbor and Hawaii exposed to something, right? Because I have a hunch that there's carrier groups down there. So I was constantly tempted to like, hey, let's send the British and just let's run the slot and see if we can get to the Solomons. But like, there's no way the Royal Navy would have agreed to that cooperatively. So I kind of tried to balance a little bit of like realism in what I was trying to do and try to last like to the end of May with what I have.
There's something that came up in this discussion, though, that I find quite fascinating. And it was the different perspective you had on the time of the game.
Mhm.
Marshall, when he was talking, he was talking about, I only have, I don't have so much time. I got to get down there and do these things, and I got to do it in a hurry.
Mhm.
And Fidelis is thinking, this is 28 days long. I need to play the long game,
Mhm.
and I can wait. I need to wait. I need to be more patient because this thing is 28 days long. I don't know what he's going to do. And it's an interesting perspective because, yes, it's something that had occurred to me on the Japanese side was when I was talking about suppressing the airfields. You had 28 days. You could have spent, I mean, look at it, only took a week for you guys to come into major contact. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it was over. It was over on day 7, right? You could have spent that first week, the entire week, just bombing his airfields at Port Moresby, Gilly Gilly, places like that, just in preparation.
Mhm.
While you moved the fleet, somewhere around Rabaul, where it was completely out of range to be detected and perfectly safe because it's kind of protected by the airfields, and it could have been there within relative easy striking distance, by maybe 3 or 4 days maximum to get to
Mhm.
any of those targets. And while meanwhile you basically suppress the heck out of these airfields, wrecking his air potential, and then move down.
Mhm.
That would have been interesting, but you didn't take it as oh, I've got this really long time to do this operation. You took it as, I got to get this done in a hurry.
Yeah, there's a lot I wanted to accomplish, but hey, now I know for next time World War II breaks out. So
There you go.
there you go.
There you go.
There you have it.
All right.
Well, thank you
guys,
both. Thank you
yeah.
very much for doing this, and I really had a blast running it. It was so much fun.
I had a
I
blast
did
playing.
too.
Thanks
I
for
did
hosting
too.
it, Achilles.
All right.
Yep.
Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, everybody who watched this both live tonight. And this is kind of at a poor hour for live viewers because everybody to the east of us is in bed. And everybody to the west of us is just barely getting up. So people will be watching this over the next day or two. Feel free to drop a comment and let us know what your observations were. And feel free again, if you are not a member of the International Kriegspiel Society, please join. Look for our Discord. Just go Discord, Kriegspiel, or whatever in Google, or you can just go to kriegspiel.org, which is our website. Use the link and then get into some of these games. And who knows, maybe you'll be on the podcast next after beating up on me. So there you go.
That's how we find people to be on the podcast, by the way. You have to beat up on Marshall. It's a rite of passage.
Part of your entrance application.
You're now a full-fledged member. Here's your pin,
I get a coffee mug.
This is our version of hazing.
You have to play in a game with me. All right, folks. Thank you. Take care, and we will see you on our next adventure. Goodbye for now.